This pandemic is exposing all the inequities in our country and is clearly demonstrating that we belong to a larger interconnected ecosystem that for too long has been controlled by a small set of individuals for their own benefit. This has come at the expense of families, workers, and the natural world. Now, we have a responsibility to respond to this crisis and to meet those inequalities and injustices head on, to create a stronger and more resilient planet and people. Our response to this crisis must center racial equity, as we've heard all throughout the day. Now, some will say that equity is not as important as quickly addressing the crisis. And to them, I say that they're both important and not mutually exclusive. Equity is not about slowing down. It's about speeding up with intention. We can speed towards recovery and bring about a sense of normalcy, but without equity at the center, we will replicate and reinforce the same ills that made the pandemic a global calamity. Equity is not an obstacle, it's a foundation. Instilling equity in our work means learning from the past to make the future better for all, but especially for those who have been traditionally left out. Equity binds us together to make us unstoppable and resilient. Getting it wrong on equity as we move forward would only create new problems and injustices, and ignoring the root causes of our current health and economic crisis leaves us vulnerable to the next crisis. Our vulnerability only ends when all members of our community, people and planet, are resilient and when we radically meet the needs and priorities of them. So for our panel, we have three objectives. First, we want to share an equity vision of the future. Second, we want to discuss what this moment needs now and how we get ready for the struggle to come. Third, we want to offer concrete ways to make equity, that vision that we have of the future, possible. Now, of course, it won't be easy to push against these entrenched systems that want to create a divided world for their own benefit and to exploit. It's never been easy to fight those systems. But we are fighters. We are strong. We are organizers, we're policymakers, change makers. We are activists, we are culture makers, we are healers, we are instigators, we are dancers. We are resilient, we are strong, and we are the ones that we've been waiting for. I believe that together we can make this happen. And what better way to get us started than with a little bit more inspiration? So I want to turn it over to the panel now and get us going on this conversation about what it's going to take to create the future that we want. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Manuel Pastor and ask you first, thank you for joining us. And I want to ask you, what's your vision for the future? And what do we need to do to get there? And welcome.
Great, glad to be with you. I should explain, normally I don't wear a headset, but there's people working in my attic right now, and so I thought this would help with the noise. Also, if anybody falls through the attic and onto the floor, please try to ignore them. It won't be a formal part of the presentation. I wanted to say that I think that there's a couple of lessons that are coming out of the sort of current crisis that I think that we really need to keep in mind as we start to think about the future. And the first is that this crisis, the disease of COVID, has revealed our illness as a society. That is, the way in which people have been marginalized and left without health insurance, the way in which people have been left precarious in terms of their employment, the ways in which people have been left vulnerable by lack of immigration status, the ways in which our prisons have been over full, and as they empty out, which is a good thing, create all sorts of problems with reentry. So it's revealed what's really a set of pre-existing conditions within the society. And what I think that means fundamentally is that while we often use the word recovery, we really should be using the word reimagination, because we don't want to recover to where we were before, with such persistent inequality, with such sharp racial disparities, with so many people sidelined from being able to participate in the mainstream of the economy. So we need to realize, I would say, 5 other things going forward, and then turn it over to the rest of the speakers. I think a couple of other things have come out of this crisis. We've realized who is essential, and it's not a well-paid hedge fund manager. It's a grocery store clerk. It's a bus driver. It's a janitor who's going to keep our buildings clean. It's a food service worker. It's obviously nurses and doctors, etc. But we've realized the value of essential work. Our task now is to make sure that that work gets rewarded with good pay and with dignity. The other thing that we've realized is the power of mutuality. The only way that we're going to protect ourselves as if we protect everyone. So one of the reasons why many of us wear a mask is not because we're scared that we will get sick, but that we want to make sure that others do not get sick. The other thing that's kind of been nailed to us with this crisis is the persistence of race and racism in terms of structuring vulnerabilities that we're seeing kind of emerge in the economy. And it means that centering racial equity in our reimagination is absolutely crucial. Last 2 things I'll say, and they kind of set the platform for whatever questions you'll ask. Alvaro, I'm doing the thing of pretending to answer the question that you asked. This is what academics do. But we've also realized that government is the ultimate backstop to a good society, that we cannot actually even protect the private sector unless we've got a robust public sector and a robust sector protecting public health. And then the last thing I think, which actually should be a driver through all of our work, is that if we really want to achieve a better vision in which we are centering racial equity in our reimagination, in which we're recognizing the fundamental dignity of all work and rewarding it appropriately, in which we're understanding that we will only do well if we do well together, that we need to center one other thing, and that's power. The reason why we have a dysfunctional system is because there are some people who are so powerful who benefit from the system that they wind up wanting to keep it that way. And unless we couple our vision of the future and the policy package we say that will get us there with an actual power building strategy so that the voices of communities that have long been marginalized and left vulnerable become central to policymaking, we're not going to get there. We are not going to white paper our way out of this crisis. We're only going to power build our way to a better future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really, yeah, great recommendations and a good idea of the future. Let's bring the other 2 panelists onto the screen if possible. And I'd like to ask them as well what their vision for the future is. So perhaps we can hand it over to Rihanna and welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. What's your vision for the future, and how do you hope that we come out of this in a better place?
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. So my vision for the future, people ask me this a lot, and I still haven't come up with a great answer because my vision, I feel like, is pretty basic. I think about the things that I want, right? And that I need: a safe, comfortable home, access to work with dignity that pays a living wage, the ability to transport myself and the people I love and to the places that we need to be, and ultimately to live in a society that doesn't cause additional pain on top of the pain of just being human, right? Like, we all experience loss, we all experience grief, we all experience heartbreak. We live in a world where essentially everything that we love more or less will be lost, and there's nothing we can do to stop that. So why do we create sort of more heartbreak, more pain, and more grief through political choices, through policy choices? And so my vision for the future is a world where we just sort of have to deal with the essential pain of being human, but society is built to both help us navigate that and to not cause additional pain. And certainly my vision for the future involves a country where it is not assumed that certain people deserve or can take or can absorb more pain than others. So, you know, I'm from the South Side of Chicago, and I often think about how a lot of things that were around me, I didn't even, or happened to me, I didn't even understand as trauma, because we are expected, when you are low income, Black, live in certain places, you're expected to essentially just absorb pain. We can incarcerate you, we can leave you without jobs, we can do all of these things, and you are just supposed to take that in. And we don't think about the ways that that reverberates beyond sort of that person. And so my vision of a future is one where we don't expect certain people to absorb, take on, and take on pain more than other people. So yeah, so I'm really excited for for us to talk sort of more about these things today. And in terms of the ways that we get there, I think that Professor Pastor is right. We are at a place where it doesn't make sense to just recreate the economy that we had before, the society that we had before. We are in a place where we have the opportunity and actually the necessity to rebuild something better. And one of the things that I'm focused on, a part of that right now, is responding to this economic crisis in ways that both help us decarbonize, reduce emissions and pollution, at the same time as we are creating a more just and equal economy that provides more opportunities, more access, and just actually rewards people for their work far better and more fairly than it did before.
Thank you, Rihanna. And I mean, I think what I'm hearing here is, action. There's power. We need to, feel human and have our needs met, as well as those of our community, in ways that improve our conditions and our living. And Solana, I want to hand it over to you. Yeah, is your vision of the future similar? What do you hope that? What do you aspire as we hopefully come out of this crisis in a better place?
Thank you, and thanks for having me at the summit. This is a fantastic group, and I'm excited about going into this future vision with my two panelists, my co-panelists, because they absolutely are illustrating and narrating a future that I want to live in. My vision and the vision of the organization that I head is a liberation economy. And that is essentially one where racism is not profitable. So that would look tremendous. That's an economy that would look tremendously different. That would change a lot of our dynamics. Like you said, Rihanna, the idea that we are supposed to endure pain is not one that's tenable. I agree with some of the points that you made, Alvaro, about speed. Our name is Liberation in a Generation, and I think one of the things that this crisis has illuminated is that we can work with speed when we want to work with speed, right? We can let people out of prison when we need to. We can send money to people when we need to. And I think what our job is to make sure that we're laying a foundation of centering people of color so that those big major reforms are not essentially recreating the harms that have been done. And so I absolutely agree that we've moved past normal, going back to normal. What I hope we've moved past going back to normal, which is difficult in a time of crisis, right? It's a very human emotion to want to pick the pieces back up and go back to what we know. It's a very human reaction, right? But I think we have to stave off that human reaction and really think about a careful response that keeps people alive and safe, especially people of color, that does allow for reimagination. And I'll just add that allows for a restructuring. And that's actually a series of responses that I've been talking to Rodney Foxworth over at Common Future about, right? This idea that we can respond, we can reimagine, we can restructure. And I think we're at the point where we have to do all of these things at once which is also very difficult. This is tough work. And I'll just say one other point. I think, you know, this idea that now we have essential, now we look at like who are really essential workers and how are we really going to value them. I think we're also seeing that essential workers are largely people of color. People of color are working a lot of essential jobs. And so I cannot foresee, I'm hoping that I can't foresee a future where people of color are not at the center of our conversations, because we are a major part of not only this economy, but our future economic prosperity. So I'll stop there.
I got to apologize to my panelists. I'm some tech issues here, but can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yes. Okay. Major tech issues, but apologize for that. So thank you so much for sharing your visions for the future. And I wanted to dive in a little bit further into a few of the things that you all have mentioned. I want to highlight that Professor Pastor, you mentioned power. Rihanna, you really, in previous conversations with us, talked about infrastructure and the need to build that up. And Solana, you've talked about the combination of those two. Can you share with us why are those so important for this moment, and how are those such critical factors in us being able to achieve this vision for the future that we all want to have? So, Professor, would you kind of elaborate a little bit more on power and the role that that's going to play in this path forward for us?
Great. Well, let me pick up on something that Solana said that I thought was very powerful, which is not being able to imagine a future in which people don't recognize who these essential workers are, that they're people of color. And we should add, it's a very gendered thing as well. It's largely women of color in the kinds of professions. The challenge is that I can imagine a future in which people don't care about that at all, because that's been kind of our history and contemporary present. And I think it's important to understand that we are in a sort of transformational moment, that what we do over the next 5 months will help set the contours for the next 5 years, will set the contours for the next 5 decades. If, for example, the speed of the moment gets people to say, oh, let's give up on that climate stuff and we'll go ahead and go back to the carbon economy, that's going to just derail the future forever. If people don't recognize that now is the moment to actually legalize, people who've been in the country for a very long time who lack legal status, that'll set a contour for the future forever. If we don't realize how bad this system of incarceration has been and reverse it in a very serious way, we will set a bad contour for a very, very long time. And the problem is that there are forces of reaction on the other side who are these market-oriented, white supremacist folks kind of storming the state capitals and making a big show when they're actually not the majority in any kind of way. So there is a big struggle out there about what future we're going to have. And I think that thinking about how it is that we make the resistance, which I think we all try to represent, much more visible in the public square, how do we make sure that we capture this moment? That's where I think kind of power plays in. Now, power has many different elements to it. Some of it's political. How does this play out in elections and policy? Some of it's narrative. How do we capture a moment in which people realize that solidarity and mutuality are really the way that we will get out of this crisis, and in which the sort of veil has been lifted on racism in the society, et cetera. So there's narrative power, and then there's just sort of community organizing power. But I think those are the tasks that are in front of us right now, and that's why I think it's so crucial for us not to forget the central role of power. I say this, in particular as an academic, we dream up really great ideas, and then we wonder why, they don't get taken up. I mean, it was a really good idea, right? But we know that bad ideas get taken up if they serve particular interests that have power, and good ideas that are about power equalization and equity and inclusion don't get taken up, even though that, it is the most rational thing in the world to have health insurance for everyone. You know that from a pandemic. It doesn't happen because there's an investment, as Rihanna said, in making sure that some people feel the most of the pain. So I just really want to center power in the conversation, as well as the imagination that we need to bring forward.
Thank you. Thank you. And Rihanna, I wanted to ask you, is power enough? Is that enough to carry the moment that towards that vision of the future that we all want?
I think power is enough, but I think that you generate power in a lot of ways, and I think that a very important part of creating and sustaining power. Excuse me if you hear a bark, it is my dog. Lyra, stop. Oh, right, is a really important part of generating and sustaining power's infrastructure, right? Is having the means to mobilize resources and adequate amounts of resources to where you need them, when you need them, and often quickly, particularly if you are in these sort of policy fights that we are engaged in now, honestly, about how the economy, when should we reopen the economy? How should that look? How do we protect workers? And the fact is that the folks that we're facing, the interests that are fighting for these sort of bad ideas, have a lot of infrastructure, right? If you're talking about the right, they not only have a cable news channel, they have media, other media outlets on their side. They have an incredibly also strong ability to take those messages that are in those places and get them repeated by members of the GOP on the floor in the Senate. And people often go look at progressives and go, why haven't you done more? Without actually acknowledging that we don't have the same infrastructure, and that the infrastructure that people think that we have is often more center left. You're talking about MSNBC, you're talking about CNN, which are, unlike, sort of media channels on the right, often still invested in sort of journalistic ethics, fact checking, and presenting quote unquote objective view of the truth. And often that objective view includes a lot of sort of Republican right-wing talking points. And so even when you're engaging with those elements of infrastructure, you're still in a vice where you're responding to sort of the way that the right frames it, because their infrastructure is so strong and it moves so quickly. And then we haven't even talked a ton about sort of policy infrastructure, think tanks, academics that write in a particular way or focus on particular topics. All of those are also ways to generate and propagate ideas. And we don't have that same strength on the left, whereas again, a lot of the sort of progressive quote unquote think tanks are in fact center left, but they still take up the majority of the resources. Similarly with like quote unquote big greens, again, might be more center left, have most of the resources. And so power is really important, but we have to start, I think, I shouldn't say start because lots of people are thinking about it, but we have to continue to think about how do we translate people power into long-standing infrastructure that has the ability to take in people, to propagate or to distribute messages, and to do it in a way that is incredibly well-resourced and moves quickly and creates a bit of a coordinated front. In a space, the progressive space is wonderful and diverse, but we still need that infrastructure to sort of coalesce, right? To bring folks together and to help us move as a coordinated unit.
Yeah. I want to do like a ton of snaps.
So power, infrastructure, Yes, a lot, definitely a lot of agreement. Solana, you talked about in our prep call, you talked about the need to have shovel-ready policies. Can you tell us about
Yeah.
that, and what does that mean, and how can that help the infrastructure and the
Yeah.
power?
Yeah, yeah. And I want to back up by just saying, like, some of the things that Rihanna was talking about in terms of infrastructure is so important because of the way that that infrastructure is able to shape our entire economic worldview. Like, so much of how we even consider what is possible, who deserves, what we're working with, like how much money we're working with, this idea of austerity, and we've really got to cut back. All of these things are generated by a robust media machine and backed up by policy think tanks that are able to have these policies that are ready for the folks that the politicians that they have bought, ready to go, right? And so, I think one of the things that we've been thinking about and really trying to work through with organizers and listen to organizers is just that. Manuel said it. If it's about power, let's center the people who are actually building power. Let's center the groups that actually can start changing our economic stories and narratives, that are turning people out to vote, that these electeds are actually accountable to. So I imagine a world where if MSNBC needs a expert on X, Y, and Z topic, they're turning to an organizing group. They're turning to the Dream Defenders. They're turning to the Young Invincibles. They're turning to BYP 100, right? They aren't necessarily turning to traditional large think tanks. And I imagine a world where we have built as a progressive movement the infrastructure that supports that supports grassroots organizers, not only with spreading and building both the political and cultural capital, but also having a policy analysis. What I'm concerned about right now is that we have several big policy ideas: federal jobs guarantee, basic income, this idea of universal family paid and sick leave, fantastic ideas. And what I'm hoping to do is, with Liberation in a Generation and other groups, is to really sit and think through the implications of all of these big policies on people of color. So if we were to do a federal jobs guarantee, let's sit and sift through all of the policy design details that would guarantee that we actually aren't replicating harm again, that we're thinking about the intersections of all these policies, and that we're thinking about how people of color move and really live in this economy and in this world, and not just in a necessarily academic sense. And in order to do that, again, we have to be asking and gathering the input and shaping this shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm with organizing groups that are actually building the power. So we're complementing that power with a racial economic analysis, and we're also making sure that that power is connecting politically, so that we can hold our elected accountable for a set of principles that actually ushers in this new vision that we want to see.
Great. I'm going to pick up for Alvaro, who has disappeared, and I guess he's been replaced by Rihanna's dog, actually. So that's quite a. So we still have 4 panelists. I just 2 comments and then a question for the 2 of you that was here. I mean, one, I think Solana's working on the Liberation in a Generation, and we've been working on this frame around solidarity economics. The idea that an economics of mutuality is actually one that will bring equity and prosperity at the same time. And I think you're absolutely right. I think both of you said this, that we lack sometimes a frame that we go back to. So we wind up with, there's that great quote that Martin Luther King, when he gave his speech after the March on Washington, it wasn't called "I Have an Issue." It was called "I Have a Dream." And how do we kind of put a frame and a dream and a sort of vision of mutuality forward? The second thing, which I think is kind of provoked by what both of you said, is my colleague Jennifer Ito has come up with this concept that she calls the flower power, that essentially at the heart of power building is base building and community organizing, and that around it is research and advocacy and legal and leadership development and communications. That too often what philanthropy does is they invest in the petals without investing in the core of the flower. And too often people who are academics, the think tanks, don't exhibit accountability to that center of the flower, the power builders. And I think that's kind of our vision of what a good and healthy ecosystem or infrastructure along the lines of what Rihanna's been talking about. You might want to comment on that, but I also know that one of the questions that was for us here, and it's one that I think definitely is relevant to people who are listening in, is, given the enormity of the tasks that are in front of us, given the grief that this crisis has caused in the world, and the way in which, as Rihanna said, it really just adds on to pre-existing grief and disproportionate pain that's existed before. How do you get yourself up in the morning? How do you find the hope and energy to meet the day? Let's start with Rihanna, because probably having a dog helps.
Having a dog does help. So some of my strength does come from the fact that she sits next to me all day while I work, which is nice. But honestly, it might sound sort of paradoxical, but one of the ways that I muster up the energy is being very open about when I don't have the energy and when I don't have the hope. I just find that pretending that none of that is happening wastes energy that I could otherwise use working. And also, I think that the idea that we will have energy every day or have hope every day doesn't exist, right? Like that's not real, because you're never the same every day. And so allowing for those ups and downs is really helpful for me. And then I think on sort of I guess less on a personal level and more sort of on in terms of my work, I think often I work at a think tank, which you all are right. Think tanks are rarely accountable to anyone but their funders. And it's tough. It's tough working in policy and sort of and trying to work with representatives and elected officials right now. It's difficult, and it feels like sometimes it feels impossible. But I also try, when those things happen, to remember that there are like multiple types of power, and that they don't all move at the same time. So right now, I'm very, my day job is working really hard on sort of gaining political power, right, and getting enough political power to move certain ideas forward, but recognizing that there's also other types of power that we have access to, in particular cultural power, because politicians don't live in a vacuum. Like, we don't understand the economy or any issues in a vacuum, right? The culture around us really influences the ways that we think about these things. And as much as we sort of lack or are building political power and don't yet have as much of it as we would like, we do, thinking about people of color, the left, progressives, we do actually have a far larger advantage when it comes to cultural power. Right? There's a reason why no one showed up at Trump's inauguration to sing or do anything, right? We have sort of access to those engines. And so I like to also think about and work with, friends and colleagues of mine around sort of cultural power. How do we build cultural power? How do we change these narratives? How do we use the fact that, there are folks with more of our views in media, in film and television, all these things? How do we actually use those things? And also, how do we get better? Particularly, I think for me and policymakers I work with, the other thing I'd like to think about is, yes, okay, so maybe we can't move every elected official we need to right now, but what are the ways that we can communicate to other folks? What are the ways that we can sort of message these ideas, not even message, but how do we communicate them in new ways, right? That enhance our power and allow us to speak to folks that we haven't spoken to before. So.
That's great. So Solana, for you, what in the midst of all this kind of sense of being overwhelmed gives you the energy to kind of keep going, and similar to the way Rihanna was talking about? By the way, Rihanna, I like the Roosevelt Institute. Solana.
In very practical terms, I keep a gratitude journal, and one of my biggest points of gratitude right now is working at an organization where I feel like I can work with groups and individuals like both of you. It's tremendously freeing. And in starting this organization, someone gave us the advice to liberate ourselves. And I think to Rihanna's earlier point, being able to say no, being able to recognize what I can take on and what I can't take on is very helpful. It's actually re-energizing. No is a powerful word. I think in other terms, honestly, like things like Zoom health, like the idea of like being on video all the time is exhausting. And it's in large part because we have to spend so much energy interpreting what's happening on the other side. We get a lot of information in nonverbal cues between people. So this being on videos is like tremendously exhausting. And we have to be able to say no. I've spent a lot of my career in the pedals, most of my career in the pedals. And so I'm also just tremendously grateful for this time where we're starting to build new relationships and a new view about the power of organizing. And what gives me life and what gives me hope is that I can be of service to building that power.
Both of what you both said something extraordinarily important, which is actually a very interesting and important generational difference, because I'm from that older generation of organizers and lefties who thought you should just burn yourself out. And the problem with that is it doesn't incorporate any of the healing that needs to take place to make ourselves healthy and to make our society healthy. So I'm super glad, as Mr. Burnout, that you really lifted that up to remind me I should go for a walk after this. Let's close. We are asked to be done in about 5 minutes, so maybe take just 2 minutes each. What do you think is kind of opening up right now in terms of the vision for the future that you put out at the beginning? How has this terrain changed and created some kind of new possibilities that you think might be the vehicles to get us to the better, more inclusive, and more healing world that both of you have talked about? Rihanna, would it be okay to start with you?
Yeah, totally. So I think, can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
What do you see as maybe some openings right now, things that have kind of shifted and opened up, like we wouldn't, like, just to give you an example, I would not have realized that everybody would realize who an essential worker is. I think that's a huge opportunity to really shift the narrative right now in some very important ways. When you start to think about your work, what do you think has kind of shifted in this moment that's a big opening that we should keep in mind as we move forward?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. And so the first one, I think sounds a bit more negative, but I think is ultimately a really good thing, which is I think this moment opened up an opportunity to realize that the economy that we lived in only appeared to function under a very narrow set of conditions, right? And that once those conditions are no longer the case, it doesn't function anymore. And I think that that's important because I think it opens up a space for folks to realize that we don't in fact control everything, that we are at the mercy of forces, that we cannot sort of lord over, which I do think was pretty absent from our dialogue before, right? And I remember even when this happened, I was like, is this a plague? Is it 2020? What is happening? This can't happen right now. But it's not as though we sort of, just because we have iPhones, you can no longer have a pandemic, right? It's not as though just because we can control the climate in our homes means that we can actually exert that same control over the climate outside. And I think that that is really important because I think it's just a reminder that we have to live in different ways. And going along with that, I think the second opportunity, particularly in climate, is that I think it opened up folks to really think about the fact that like the consumption patterns that we had before, maybe you actually don't need in the same way, right? There's all this, like I don't know, maybe it's a millennial thing. People love to go on trips for their birthdays, a birthday trip, so it's like, I'm turning 30, let's go to Cancun. And that,
Now it's I'm turning 30, let's go to Whole Foods.
exactly. But I think that that opens up a space to wonder, like, did I really need to do that? Does travel need to be a status symbol the way that it was, right? I didn't drive my car for however many days. And that actually opening up a space. And I think people seeing that, yes, parts of that are difficult, but parts of that are enjoyable and more enjoyable than the life that they had, the way that they were living before. And I think that those are actually two really fundamental opportunities that I think can, in the long term, really shift the ways that we structure our economy.
Great. Let's shift to Solana so we can stay a bit on time.
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, during the primaries, we saw a lot of debate about what we can do and what we can't do. And I think we have proven that we can do big things quickly. And so what I'm hopeful for, and I think is a new opportunity, is that if someone says, oh, that's just too big, we don't have to accept that anymore. And we actually live in a condition where we have to do big, bold structural efforts. I'll say the second piece is a bit more personal, but I think it has to do with how we interact with one another and this economy, in that I'm really grateful that since we all have to stay at home and we interact this way, that we are whole people, that we come to every situation with our dogs, with our lunch, with our closet full of black shirts. Like, we are whole people, and that's what, and we should bring those everywhere. And so I think that's really giving me hope, because what I'm thinking about is that maybe we can now see that we all need safety and security, especially people of color. We all need, everyone should have basic needs met, that we all belong after all. So those are the two things that are giving me hope in this moment.
So let me say just a couple of things that I think Alvaro might be coming up, and if he's not, I'll be making the transition to close this. So Rihanna, part of what you were saying kind of reminded me of when I was in college. After one particular night of excess, which happens in college, we went out to eat breakfast, and it was a terrible breakfast with bacon and eggs and just awful kind of stuff. And someone pointed out that it was very unhealthy. And a friend of mine said, well, sometimes you just need to show your system who's boss. And I think what we've been doing over the years has been trying to show Mother Earth who's boss. It's not us. And what Mother Earth is doing is insisting that, yes, a virus can take down a civilization, particularly one that leaves so many people precarious, so many people without healthcare, so many people at risk, and that we need going forward to recognize how serious the climate crisis is as well as a fundamental risk to all of us going forward. I think this is a moment of tremendous pain and grief and loss, and also a tremendous moment of opportunity in which some fundamental realizations can be put forward. The idea that we need to stand together in order to actually make progress. The idea that racism has been a poison that has made our society sicker, not just particular in groups, which it definitely has in terms of the disproportionate pain, but that leaves our whole society weaker, and that what we need to do is to center equity and center racial equity in particular in terms of how we respond, how we reimagine, and how we restructure. And thank you, Solana, for that. I will be using that phrase from now on. As you know, academics, the first time they borrow, will actually acknowledge that I took it from Solana Rice. The second time I'll use it, and I'll forget to credit you. And the third time I will say, as I have long argued. That's just the way we academics roll. It's been such a pleasure to spend time with Rihanna and Solana. Solana I've known and been a big fan of for quite a long time. Rihanna, you're amazing, and I look forward to working with you even more. Let me turn things over to Alvaro to bring us to a close.
Thank you so much, and sincere apologies for some of the tech issues. But actually, y'all are so fantastic that I just felt like I needed to get out of the way and just have you all talk amongst each other, because all the preparation up to this point, I've been inspired just by hearing your voices and your perspectives. So thank you again so much.